They laughed at her handbag. Not quietly, not behind her back. Right to her face, at the table, in front of everyone. It was a Tuesday lunch at the most expensive restaurant in the city, the kind of place where the menu has no prices because if you need to ask, you shouldn't be there. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, a waiter who introduces himself by name and remembers how you take your water. And right there, at that table, surrounded by the women she had called her closest friends for 11 years, Diane held up the handbag and laughed. "Oh, honey," she said, is this from the market?" The table went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then they all laughed. All 4 of them. And Camille, the woman who owned that handbag, who had saved 3 months to buy it because she wanted to feel like she belonged at that table, Camille smiled. Because that's what she always did. She smiled, and she stayed quiet, and she told herself it didn't matter. It mattered. It had been mattering for 11 years. But here's what none of those women knew that Tuesday at lunch. Here's what Diane didn't know when she held up that handbag and laughed. Camille was already sitting on a secret that was about to change everything. Not gradually, not quietly. All at once, in a way that none of them would ever fully recover from. And the woman they had been laughing at for 11 years. She was the only one in that room who already knew it was coming. Stay with me, because the ending of this story will leave you speechless. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened at the end, you need to understand what was happening all along. Camille Nwasu had met these women in the way that most adult friendships form, through circumstance, proximity, and the particular loneliness of being new somewhere. She had moved to the city 12 years ago. 31 years old, recently divorced, with a degree in textile engineering that nobody in her new city seemed to know was a real subject, a modest apartment on the east side, and the kind of quiet determination that doesn't announce itself but doesn't stop either. She had met Diane at a neighborhood community meeting. Diane was polished, well-connected, the kind of woman who knew everyone in the room before she walked in. She had introduced Camille to Serena, who introduced her to Priya, who introduced her to Margaret. And just like that, she had a friend group. Or something that looked like one. On paper, they had things in common. They were all roughly the same age. They all lived in the same part of the city. They all met for lunch on the first Tuesday of every month at rotating restaurants, always upscale, always somewhere with a reservation list. But underneath that surface, the differences were enormous. Diane's husband was a senior partner at a law firm. Serena had inherited her family's property portfolio at 28. Priya ran a successful interior design company with offices in 3 cities. Margaret did well. Nobody was entirely sure what Margaret did, but she spent money with the casual ease of someone who had never once had to think about whether she could afford something. And then there was Camille, who worked from a small studio apartment, building a business that nobody took seriously. What nobody at that table knew, what they had never once bothered to ask, was what Camille was actually building behind that studio door. But we'll get to that. The mockery had started small, the way these things always do. A comment about her car, not the car itself necessarily, just the way Diane had said, "Oh, you drove yourself," when Camille arrived at a dinner party, with a specific emphasis on the word yourself that carried about 14 layers of meaning. A comment about her apartment, when Priya had visited once and said the space had potential in the way that people say potential when they mean the opposite. A comment about her clothes, her holidays, her phone, the restaurant she had suggested for one Tuesday lunch that Margaret had vetoed with. "I don't think they take reservations, do they? That's not really our kind of place." None of it was ever said with obvious cruelty. That was the sophisticated part. It always came wrapped in smiles and light laughter and plausible deniability. The specific technique of women who have spent their whole lives in rooms where status is the real language and have become fluent in saying devastating things while technically saying nothing at all. Camille understood the language perfectly. She had just never found a way to respond to it that didn't cost her something. So she smiled, and she stayed, and she told herself that the good parts outweighed the bad parts. For 11 years, she told herself that. And then came the Tuesday that finally broke the silence, in the most unexpected way any of them could have imagined. Here's what Camille was actually doing in that small studio apartment on the east side. She was building something that none of them had any idea existed. And by the time they found out, it would be too late to pretend they had ever believed in her. It had started as a side project, almost accidentally, the way the best things sometimes start. She had always worked with fabric. Her degree was in textile engineering, but her real knowledge went deeper than the degree. It was the knowledge of someone who had been surrounded by cloth and thread and pattern her whole life, whose grandmother had been a tailor in Lagos, whose mother had taught her that the difference between fabric that lasts and fabric that doesn't is not the price tag, but the construction. She had started designing sustainable fabrics. Not fashion, the fabric itself, the material, the technology of how cloth is made, what it's made from, how long it lasts, what happens to it when it's done. It was not a glamorous business to explain at lunch. So you make cloth, Margaret had said once, with a smile that meant she thought this was charmingly small. Textile engineering, Camille had said. Sustainable material development. Right, Margaret said. How sweet. How sweet. That word. That one word that people use when they want to dismiss something without appearing to dismiss it. Camille had heard that word so many times across that table that she had stopped flinching at it. She had started using it as fuel instead. What none of them knew, what Camille had not told them, partly because they never really asked, and partly because she had learned that her work was safer when she kept it away from their commentary, was what was actually happening in that small studio. She had spent 7 years developing a fabric. One specific fabric. A textile made from a combination of recycled ocean, plastic, and organic plant fiber that was lighter than cotton, stronger than linen, biodegradable within 18 months of disposal, and could be produced at a cost competitive with conventional synthetic fabrics. She had a name for it. She called it Camilla, one letter different from her own name, a small private joke that nobody had ever been curious enough to ask about. She had filed the patents 2 years ago. She had been in quiet conversations with 3 of the largest sustainable fashion houses in the world for 14 months. 14 months. While they were laughing about her car and her apartment and her phone and her restaurant suggestions. She was 14 months into negotiations with people who flew business class to meet her. And not a single woman at that table had any idea. The Tuesday lunches continued. Every first Tuesday, new restaurant, same table, same dynamic. Camille came because she kept hoping it would become something real. It kept not becoming that. And then came the Tuesday with the handbag, the Tuesday that would set everything in motion. She had saved for it for 3 months. Not because she couldn't have bought something cheaper, she could have. But she had seen it in a small boutique near her studio. A structured tan leather bag, simple, well-made, the kind of thing that would last 20 years if you treated it right. And she had wanted it with the specific want of someone who has been telling themselves for a long time that they don't need nice things. She had bought it. She had carried it to Tuesday lunch feeling, for the first time in a long time, like she looked the part. She had no idea that bag was about to become the most important object in this entire story. Diane noticed it the moment she sat down. Camille saw her notice it. The quick scan, the small assessment, the calculation that happened behind Diane's eyes in the half-second before she decided what to do with the information. She waited until everyone was seated and the first drinks had arrived. Then she reached across and picked it up. Without asking. Just picked it up and turned it over in her hands, the way you handle something you've already decided is beneath you. "Oh, honey," she said, "is this from the market?" 1 second of silence. Then the laugh. Serena's came first, a short, bright sound, quickly covered by her hand but not quickly enough. Then Priya's lower, more controlled, but there. Then Margit's the longest, the most comfortable, the laugh of someone who had never once felt self-conscious about laughing. "It's very practical," Diane said, which was worse than the laugh. Camille smiled. She picked up her water glass and took a sip and looked out the window for a moment. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, ordinary Tuesday afternoon life happening at full speed. Inside, her friends were already moving on to the next topic. The bag was forgotten by them before the main course arrived. But Camille had made a decision in that moment, a quiet one, a final one. And 4 days later, the phone call came. Everything she had been building, everything they had called sweet, was about to speak for itself. The meeting had been 14 months in the making. 14 months of emails and calls and video conferences across 3 time zones. 14 months of sample submissions and technical reviews and patent verification and conversations that started at 8 in the morning and ended at midnight. 14 months of doing the work while the world, or at least the small part of it that sat at the Tuesday lunch table, paid no attention. But someone else had been paying very close attention. The company was called Vern Collective. If you followed sustainable fashion, you knew the name. If you didn't follow sustainable fashion, you had almost certainly worn something made with their materials without knowing it. They supplied fabric technology to 11 of the 15 largest ethical fashion houses in the world. They were headquartered in Amsterdam with production facilities in Portugal, Vietnam, and a new innovation center in South Africa. Their head of materials acquisition was a woman named Dr. Astrid Becker. She had contacted Camille through a textile engineering forum where Camille had posted a technical paper 17 months ago. The message had been 4 sentences, professional, precise, asking if Camille would be willing to discuss her research further. Camille had read it 3 times before replying. She didn't tell anyone, not her neighbors, not her mother, not a single person at the Tuesday lunch table. She just went back to work and made sure everything was ready. The Thursday after the Tuesday lunch with the handbag, Camille sat at her studio desk at 7 in the morning with a cup of tea and her laptop and a folder of documents she had been preparing for 3 weeks. At 7:30, the video call connected. Dr. Becker was on screen, silver-haired, precise, with the manner of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms where only the work mattered and had no patience for anything else. Also on the call, Vern Collective's CEO, their chief sustainability officer, and their lead legal counsel. 4 of the most powerful people in global sustainable fashion. All on a call at 7:30 in the morning. For a woman in a studio apartment on the east side of a city, they had flown over to get to their offices. The call lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Camille had prepared for every question. She had the production cost data, the biodegradation timeline studies, the tensile strength comparisons, the carbon footprint analysis across the full production lifecycle, the patent documentation, the pilot batch results from the small manufacturer she had worked with for 8 months to prove the concept at scale. She answered every question directly. When she didn't know something, she said so, and told them when she would have the answer. When they pushed back on the production cost projections, she showed them the methodology and walked them through it step by step. She did not back down from a single number. And then, at 10:15, Dr. Becker leaned toward the camera and said something that Camille had been waiting 7 years to hear. "Ms. Nwasu," Dr. Becker said, "I want to be direct with you. We have reviewed 18 sustainable textile innovations in the past 2 years. Camilla is the first one that solves all 3 problems simultaneously: cost, performance, and end-of-life impact. We would like to move to acquisition discussions." Camille kept her expression neutral. She had practiced keeping her expression neutral for this exact moment for a very long time. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "I'll have my legal team contact yours to begin the process." She closed the call. She sat in her studio for exactly 30 seconds. Then she put her face in her hands and cried. Not from sadness, not from relief exactly. From the specific release of something held tightly for 7 years, finally being allowed to be put down. But the number, the actual number they agreed on, I haven't told you that yet. And trust me, you need to hear it. I'm going to tell you what Vern Collective paid. Not to be sensational, not to make this story about money, but because the number is the full weight of what 11 years of Tuesday lunch mockery had been aimed at, without any of those women ever knowing it existed. And when you hear it, think about the handbag, think about the word sweet, think about how practical. The acquisition agreement, signed 8 weeks after that Thursday morning call, was for the global exclusive manufacturing and licensing rights to the Camille textile technology. The figure was $4.7 million up front. $4.7 million. Plus a royalty structure on every meter of Camille fabric produced under license for the next 25 years. The royalty projections, based on Vern Collective's existing production volumes and their 5-year expansion plan, put the total value of the deal, conservatively, at somewhere between $40 and $60 million over the life of the agreement. Let me say that again, so it lands properly. The woman with the market handbag, the woman with the practical car, and the apartment with potential, and the sweet little business making cloth, had just signed a deal worth, at minimum, $40 million. Built entirely alone, in a studio, over 7 years while her friends laughed. She told nobody immediately. She called her mother in Lagos that evening, and they talked for 2 hours, and both of them cried, and then her mother said, "I always knew. From the beginning, I always knew it was going to be something real." And Camille said, "I know, Mama, I know you did." Then she ordered jollof rice from the place 3 streets over that she had been ordering from every Friday since she moved to the city. She ate it at her studio desk, surrounded by 12 years of work. And she was the happiest she had ever been in her life. But she still had one more thing she needed to do, one more Tuesday lunch she needed to attend. She went to the next Tuesday lunch. Of course she did. Some people thought this was the strange part of the story when she told it later. Why go back? Why sit at that table again after everything? Camille always gave the same answer. "Because I wanted to see it clearly one last time," she said, "before I let it go." And she had planned exactly what she was going to say, every word, every pause. She had rehearsed it in her head every morning for 2 weeks. She arrived at the restaurant in a car service, not a taxi, a car service. Black car, suited driver, the kind of arrival that is impossible to misread. She was wearing a dress she had bought in Amsterdam during the in-person signing meeting, a deep burgundy wrap dress from a small independent designer. Simple, perfectly cut, the kind of thing that costs what it costs and makes no apology for it. She was carrying the tan leather handbag. The same one. Deliberately. She was the last to arrive. All 4 of them were already seated. Diane saw her first. Camille watched the assessment happen, the car outside, the dress, something different in Camille's posture, the way she crossed the room without hesitating. Something was different. Diane couldn't identify it yet. But she felt it, the way you feel a weather change before the sky shows it. "You look well," Diane said carefully. "Thank you," Camille said. "I feel well." She sat down, ordered water, looked at the menu, was entirely, completely calm. The lunch proceeded normally for the first 40 minutes. Serena was renovating her second property. Priya had returned from Milan. Margit had opinions about a new restaurant she considered overrated. Camille listened, responded when addressed, was pleasant. And waited. The way someone waits when they know exactly what is coming, and they are simply choosing the right moment to let it arrive. It was Priya who asked first. "So Camille, anything new? How is the textile thing going?" The textile thing. 11 years at this table, still the textile thing. Camille set down her fork. She looked at all 4 of them, Diane, Serena, Priya, Margit, one face at a time. And then she said the number. Not dramatically, not with anger, not the rehearsed speech she had sometimes imagined during the harder years, the one where she listed every small cruelty with its exact date and wording. Just clearly, just the facts. The fabric, the 7 years, Vern Collective, the deal. The number. Out loud, at the table, with the handbag sitting right there beside her chair. The table was completely silent. Diane's wine glass was halfway to her mouth and stayed there. Serena had stopped chewing. Priya's expression moved through 5 different things in about 2 seconds. Surprise, recalculation, something that looked briefly like shame, then the careful neutral of someone pulling themselves together. Margaret said nothing. She just stared. The waiter appeared to check on them. "Wonderful," Camille said pleasantly. "Thank you." The waiter left. The silence continued. Finally, Diane set down her glass. "Camille, that's incredible. Why didn't you ever tell us?" Camille looked at her. And what she said next was not what any of them expected. "Because," Camille said quietly, "every time I tried to tell you anything real about my work, one of you said something that made it smaller. Not once. Every time, for 11 years. She paused. "I stopped sharing it with you a long time ago. Not out of secrecy, out of protection. I needed to protect the work from the way this table talked about things it hadn't decided to take seriously yet." Another pause. "I don't say this with anger," she said. "I genuinely don't, but I think it's important for all of us that it's said clearly, at least once." She picked up her fork. She finished her meal. And nobody at that table said another word for a very long time. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Because what happened after that Tuesday tells you everything about who each of those women actually was. And one of their responses, the one you'd least expect, was the one that changed Camille most of all. Margaret never called again. Not a text, not an email, not a Happy New Year message. Nothing. Camille found this oddly clarifying. Margaret had never really been a friend. She had been a member of a social group that Camille happened to also be in. When the social calculation changed, when Camille was no longer someone whose presence made Margaret feel better by comparison, she simply removed herself. No drama, no explanation. Just gone. And honestly, that was the most honest thing Margaret had ever done. Serena called 2 weeks later. The conversation was awkward in the way that honest conversations between people who have been dishonest for a long time are always awkward. She said she was sorry, generally, not specifically, not for the individual moments, the kind of apology that is more about relieving the apologizer than actually reckoning with what happened. Camille accepted it gracefully. She did not pretend it was more than it was. They did not have lunch again. Priya was different. Priya called 4 days after the lunch and asked if she could come over. She arrived at Camille's studio, the same studio she had once described as having potential, and she stood in the doorway and looked at it differently this time. At the samples on the wall, the technical drawings, the fabric swatches in their labeled archive boxes, the organized, serious evidence of 7 years of sustained, rigorous, quietly brilliant work. "I didn't know," Priya said. "I knew you worked. I just didn't understand what you were actually doing." "You didn't ask," Camille said, not harshly, just accurately. Priya nodded. "I didn't ask," she said. "That was wrong, I'm sorry." It was a different kind of apology. It named the specific thing. It didn't dress itself up in comfortable language. And that difference, that small, crucial difference, was everything. Camille looked at her for a moment. Then she put the kettle on. And they talked, really talked, for the first time in 11 years, for 3 hours. That friendship became something real. And Diane. Diane called 3 times in the 2 weeks after the lunch. Camille didn't answer, not out of spite, but because she had made a decision about what she was willing to spend her energy on. On the 3rd call, she picked up. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. Diane said she was sorry. She said she hoped they could move forward. "I believe you're sorry," Camille said. But I don't have the energy to rebuild this particular friendship. I wish you well. I genuinely do." She hung up. But that wasn't the last she heard from Diane. Not by a long way. What came next, 18 months later, was something Camille never saw coming. The deal with Verne Collective closed completely 8 weeks after the call. Camille moved out of the East Side studio. Not to a bigger apartment, not to a penthouse, not to any of the places people with sudden money sometimes go to prove to themselves and others that they have arrived. She moved to a building with a proper ground floor commercial space. She opened a lab, and what she built inside it was, in many ways, even more important than the deal. The Camilla Innovation Lab was not a vanity project. It was not named after herself. It was named after the fabric. And it was a proper working research facility focused on next-generation sustainable textile development, staffed by 8 researchers in the first year and 12 in the second. She hired young textile engineers, specifically from underrepresented backgrounds. Not as a marketing gesture. As a deliberate act of building the kind of environment she had wished existed when she was starting out, where the work was taken seriously, where nobody used the word sweet to describe a 7-year research project. She was building for the next Camille, the one who was out there right now, in a small studio somewhere, working on something that nobody was taking seriously yet. She gave talks. She sat on panels. She was good at all of it, clear, direct, funny in a dry, precise way that audiences responded to. At one panel, a sustainable fashion conference in Copenhagen, the moderator asked the question that moderators always ask when they know someone has a story. Was there a moment when you almost stopped? Camille thought about it. Many moments, she said. But there was one period, around year 5, when I went through about 6 months of being genuinely unsure whether what I was doing was real or whether I had just convinced myself it was real because I needed it to be. What kept you going? The moderator asked. And her answer, the thing she said next, is the part I need you to hear most of all. I had people in my life who didn't take it seriously, she said carefully. And I had a choice. I could let their lack of faith become my own, or I could use it as data. Information about what the work looked like from the outside before it was finished. And I decided to use it as data, she said. Their doubt told me what the work still needed to prove, so I made it prove those things, one by one, until there was nothing left to doubt. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it applauded. A year and a half after that last Tuesday lunch, a letter arrived. Physical, handwritten, in an envelope with careful handwriting she recognized immediately. Camille sat with it unopened for 2 days, not from fear, from the feeling that some things deserved to be received slowly. On the 3rd morning she made tea, sat at her desk by the window, and opened it. It was from Diane. 4 pages, handwritten on cream notepaper, the handwriting getting less controlled as the pages went on, as if the act of writing had loosened something that had been held shut for a long time. Diane did not begin with an apology. She began with a memory. A specific one. A Tuesday lunch from about 6 years ago when Camille had mentioned, briefly, something she was working on with a new plant fiber, and Diane had changed the subject before Camille had finished her sentence. Diane wrote that she remembered the exact moment, that she remembered the look on Camille's face, not hurt, just the slight adjustment of someone who has learned to expect a door to close, and that she had seen that look and continued changing the subject anyway. I have been thinking about that moment for 18 months, she wrote. Not because of what happened after, because of who I was in it. I changed the subject because I wasn't interested. Because in that moment, my disinterest felt more important than your work, and I let that be true without examining it. She wrote about the pattern, not defensively, just tracing it back year by year with the uncomfortable specificity of someone who has done real reckoning. I think I found your ordinariness, as I understood it then, comforting, she wrote. I think that is a shameful thing to have to write, but I think it's true. And then, on the 4th page, she wrote something that Camille read 3 times. 3 times, and then she sat very still for a very long time. I don't want anything from you. I'm not writing this to ask you back into my life or to repair something that I don't think can be repaired. I'm writing it because you told me the truth at that table, and you deserve to have it returned. The truth is that you were the most interesting person at every lunch we ever had. I knew it, and I chose, repeatedly, to make you feel otherwise. I don't know why I need you to know that I know it, but I do. I hope your work changes everything you intend it to change. I believe it will. Camille folded the letter. She sat for a while. Then she got a piece of cream notepaper and wrote back. 2 sentences. Thank you for this. It took courage to write, and I received it in the spirit it was sent. She sealed it and posted it. She never heard from Diane again. And that was okay. Some things don't need a sequel, they just need to be said and heard. She still has it. The tan leather bag. The one from the market, well, not the market. A boutique. But it doesn't matter anymore where it came from. Because what that bag became, what it meant by the end, has nothing to do with where it was made or what it cost. It sits on the shelf in her office at the Camille Innovation Lab. Not displayed, not framed, not lit with a spotlight like some kind of trophy. Just sitting there, the way useful things sit on shelves. Sometimes the young researchers notice it. It's not new. It's been used. It has a small scuff on the bottom left corner from where she set it down on a rough surface years ago. Once, a researcher named Adiz, 24, brilliant, the kind of young woman who reminded Camille of herself in the early years, had picked it up. Is this vintage? Adiz asked. No, Camille said. Just old. I've had it a long time. It's beautiful, Adiz said. Camille looked at it. It really is, she said. And what she didn't say, what she kept to herself, was the whole story attached to it. The table, the laugh, the moment she had looked out the window and made the decision. She had never bought a replacement. Not because she couldn't. She could buy 100 replacements now. But because this one had been there for all of it. The 7 years, the Tuesday lunches, the moment Diane held it up. The Thursday morning, when Dr. Becker said, "We would like to move to acquisition discussions." The floor beside her desk, when she put her face in her hands and cried. It had earned its place on that shelf. It had been there for all of it. I want to tell you where Camille is today. Because the story doesn't end with the deal, or the lab, or the letter. It ends, if stories like this ever end, with something she says every year to a room full of young people who are right at the beginning of their own version of this journey. Camille fabric is in production in 3 countries. It has been used in collections by 7 major sustainable fashion houses. Last year, it was specified as the recommended material standard for a UN-backed initiative on textile sustainability in developing markets, which meant that the girl from Lagos, whose grandmother was a tailor, had produced a fabric that was now being used to set global standards. She finds this funny in the way that only impossible things that actually happened can be funny. The Tuesday friend group dissolved after that last lunch. The group chat went silent within a week. Someone removed themselves, then another. Then it was just Camille and Priya, which eventually became a different, private conversation that had nothing to do with reservations or restaurant reviews. Priya is one of her closest friends now. The real kind, the kind you call before you call anyone else. It took 11 years and an earthquake to build it. It was worth every year. Camille gives a talk every year to the incoming researchers at the lab. She tells them 3 things. First, the work has to be genuinely real, not impressive sounding, not fundable looking. Actually, technically, honestly real, because real is the only thing that lasts. Second, the people who don't take you seriously are not your obstacle. They are your information. They tell you what the work looks like from the outside before it's finished. Use that. Build until the outside matches the inside. And the third thing, the one she says last and says most slowly. Protect your work from the people who haven't earned the right to have opinions about it yet. Not forever, just until it can stand on its own. Build it in whatever quiet space you have. Build it honestly. Build it completely. And then, when it's ready, let it speak for itself. She pauses. It will always speak louder than anyone who ever doubted it. She picks up her bag, the tan leather one, scuffed corner, earned shelf, and goes back to work. Before you go, I need to say one thing directly to you. This story is not about revenge. I know it might feel like it is. I know the part where Diane holds up the handbag and then Camille says the number out loud at the table. I know that feels like justice. And it is, in its small way. But that's not what this story is actually about. This story is about what happens when you decide to protect your work from the noise. When you decide that the opinions of people who have never been inside what you're building do not get to be the measure of what it's worth. Camille didn't build Camilla to prove those women wrong. She built it because it was real and it was hers, and it was worth building. The proving wrong was just what happened when she finished. Think about that. Think about the thing in your life right now that someone has called small. Sweet, practical, potential, not really our kind of place. Think about the version of you that smiled and picked up your water glass and looked out the window. What if you stopped explaining it to people who haven't earned the right to understand it yet? What if you just built it all the way until it could speak for itself? The handbag is still on the shelf. The work is still in production. And somewhere out there, maybe at a Tuesday lunch, maybe at an office, maybe in a family dinner table conversation, someone is being made to feel small right now. I hope this story reaches them today. Because the person being underestimated might be building something that changes everything. She just hasn't finished yet.